we need to focus a bit on definitions, because there are some mechanics about definitions that we need to come to terms with. So I think isms are, for the most part, umbrella terms, especially when we're talking about traditions. So the terms socialism and communism, they're umbrella terms. Now, this may present us with a trouble, but it doesn't actually. It actually helps us to combat some problematic assessments of the situation. So let's take the camp of Marxists. It's very difficult to find the main thinkers to agree with each other in everything. They deviate with respect to some things. Now, obviously, this applies to thinkers. It doesn't apply to people who are just blindly obeying to the orders of Lenin or Stalin, and they're paid to not think, for instance, or not paying at all. They starve by famines. But the point is, you don't think. The vanguard party does the thinking. That's in especially the Leninist and Maoist view. But it's important to bear in mind that all these isms, they show, in a sense, a spectrum. Now, this implies that there are several kinds of Marxism. There is orthodox Marxism, which I think is also called classical Marxism, Western Marxism, neo-Marxism. There are several kinds of Marxism. Now, if we pay close attention at the mechanics of definitions, we will see that the objection, but real communism has never been tried, is completely insignificant. And it is for the following reason. If the goal is to find an essence that makes one a Marxist and treats Marxism as completely distinctive from all other theories, we won't find it. And this is a feature of language that is particularly acknowledged in the 20th century. Let me just give you a very quick example. One of the biggest philosophers of the 20th century was Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he reacted against essentialism in language. And he was saying we need to pay close attention at language. And he said, if I ask you to define the essence of games, of what we conventionally call games, you won't be able to find it. And the same applies for chairs and tables. And he thinks it applies for everything, for almost everything. Now, obviously, not everyone agrees with the idea that it applies for everything, but for a substantial amount of things it applies. So he says, you can't find one thing that all chairs share in common, or one thing that all tables share in common. That doesn't mean that you can't distinguish reliably between chairs and tables. So you don't have to find an essence in order to reliably distinguish between chairs and tables. And the same applies for political theories. Now, why do I say this? I'm not saying this, obviously, to say that to guard any theory. I'm actually showing that theories are not to be understood in an abstract sense, where we're just talking about the abstract idea of a theory, but we need to understand them in their historical context as they evolved and as they continue evolving, and we need to understand them in terms of family resemblances with one another. So even if you can't find an essence that makes one a Marxist, and all people who call themselves Marxists, it accounts for, and it separates them with everyone else. If we cannot find this, that doesn't mean that we cannot talk about Marxism.
It doesn't mean they're not related. If I remember correctly, Wittgenstein said this was his analogy, if you look at a family photograph and everyone is wearing glasses and different clothes and they don't look identical, but they have some common features that you could link up, you would say, well, they're clearly related even if they're not the same person. And so you can have a broad family of Marxism because they share certain goals and a shared vision of the future. I think that's what tethers all these things together. I think broadly all the different classifications of Marxism disagree on means, but they all at least they say, they agree on the end of a stateless, classless, egalitarian utopia.
Yes, exactly. That, and Wittgenstein was talking about family resemblances. And he was saying that that's how we use in order to distinguish, in order to describe things and talk about them. And that's ultimately how we navigate into the world. So why is that important? Because it neutralizes the claim that true Marxism has never been tried. And here is where, methodologically speaking, Marxists are particularly vulnerable to one thing, that a lot of people are vulnerable. Essentially everyone who talks about practical contexts in an idealistic fashion. They can't handle comparative judgment. Now, let me say why that is. So it is absolutely obvious that in some views of Marxism, some conceptions of Marxism, Marxism has never been tried. But that applies to every theory. That applies to every theory. It doesn't create a comparative advantage to Marxism. And let me say why. Because it is absolutely certain that we can find someone who will say, yeah, but my view of Marxism, my specific view of Marxism has never been put to practice. Maybe others failed, but mine hasn't been tried.
I'd like to modify the statement a little bit, just to be more precise if we can. So when people say real communism has never been tried, they often mean Marxism. Marxism has in fact been tried. Real communism will never be achieved because it's impossible, because the Marxist conception of communism, both in means and ends, is wrong. So communism being the stateless, classless, egalitarian utopia, for the rest of time as well, is akin to promising to enact heaven on earth, and the possibility for a fallible man to do that, not going to happen. So if you look at, okay, if you are setting an impossible goal, and it's attractive and alluring, but you're never going to achieve it, is the purpose of the goal to actually get there, or is the goal the promise that you can get to people to buy in order to acquiesce to you power? Through the murdering of your enemies, the consolidation of all resources and force, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, under the auspices of the vague promise that suddenly the dictatorship will just wither away magically. And don't worry, the dictatorship won't be tyrannical because it's staffed by the proletariat who, as Engels says in Conditions of the Working Class in England, because they've never had property, they don't have the corrupting force of greed to tempt them to be evil, so therefore they will both kill all the bourgeoisie but then not be murderous when they've got even more absolute power and resources. And when they have all the resources, they won't be corrupted by that property either. It's not meant to make sense. I genuinely think that real Marxism has in fact been tried, because the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia, Venezuela, all of these states are examples of real Marxism because they were murderous dictatorships. And I think that's actually the purpose. So you can say real communism has not been achieved, because it never will be achieved. But Marxism has been tried, and it's been tried repeatedly, and that's why we've got hundreds of millions of deaths. And anyone just needs to take a look at the murderous statements from Marx and Engels to know that this was the express purpose of this.
So I agree with you that when it comes to the people who are the dark triad ones, their goal in communicating that theory and using insights from that theory, and especially the language of that theory to rally up some people for their purposes, it's absolutely power for them. And I've said so, and it's not just for them. I think that the naked, amoral or immoralist use of power grab is something way more prevalent than we see in Marxism. We see it in a lot of political movements. So I agree with you that for some people it's the case. The purpose I want to stay on my previous statement is because I want to address the future Thomas Sowells, let's say. I want to say that I want to talk to some people who may be attracted to Marxism and are intelligent, and they still haven't seen a lot of the methodological issues for it. So I don't want to talk to them and say you're murderous psychopaths.
No, they're the ones that are going to be murdered. That's the thing that they have to understand. And I don't want that for them either.
Yeah. So let me just say also about that means that the argument real communism or real Marxism has never been tried becomes neutralized, because for the precise reason that we can reliably distinguish between chairs and tables. We can distinguish between political movements if the overwhelming majority of the manifestations of some movements have only made the world significantly worse, then we have very good reasons to say, well, it's time we stopped being attracted to that theory.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.